we'll have our presenters present. So Leah, turning that over to you.
Well, welcome on behalf of the Michigan Coastal Management Program and the Michigan Association of Planning to this opportunity to help decision makers and coastal communities progress along the Michigan Coastal Management Program's pathway to resilience. This is the first in a 5-webinar series that's aimed at really moving from analysis to action, and we are so delighted to have you all join us. My name is Leah DuMouchel. I'm the Director of Programs and Communications at the Michigan Association of Planning, and I'm going to present today's session as well as helping to host future sessions. And my colleague, whom you met at the beginning, Wendy Ramson, is here today as well to host and facilitate this conversation. And I would like to first introduce you to our partner at EGLE, Melissa Letosky. She's the Coastal Waters Coordinator for the Water Resources Division, and she's going to start us off today with a brief overview of that pathway to resilience before we dive into today's workshop on messaging.
Great. Thank you so much, Leah. As Leah said, I'm Melissa Letosky, Coastal Waters Coordinator with the Michigan Coastal Management Program. The Coastal Management Program is excited to be partnering with MAP to bring you this Coastal Resilience webinar series. Today, I'll be sharing a brief overview of our program's pathway to resilience to kick off the series. Here we have a quick intro to the Coastal Management Program for those who might be unfamiliar with us. The Coastal Management Program is authorized through the Coastal Zone Management Act and funded in part through the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Our mission is to protect, preserve, restore, enhance, and wisely develop the coastal natural resources and cultural heritage on the nation's longest freshwater coastline. This slide outlines how we do our work to achieve our mission. We focus on providing technical assistance and financial assistance for creative coastal projects related to our 5 focus areas: public access, community development, coastal hazards, coastal waters, and coastal habitat. We strive to assist coastal communities' ability to understand risks and mitigate coastal hazards, create healthy habitats that provide for human use and enjoyment, support safe public access, and support resilient and sustainable coastal communities. Here we have a photo taken on Lake Michigan during the recent high water period. Water levels on the Great Lakes have ranged from record lows to record highs over the last 10 years, which resulted in coastal erosion and flooding that had not been seen in Michigan for decades. These significant changes in water levels have resulted in negative impacts to our coastal natural resources, property, and critical infrastructure. It emphasized the need for our coastal communities to plan for and respond to these challenges in a resilient way. It's the goal of the Coastal Management Program to leverage resources and partnerships to help build coastal community resilience throughout the state. Here in Michigan, we have over 300 coastal communities and over 40 coastal counties, so we do have quite a bit of ground to cover when it comes to building resilience. And for those who may be new to the concept of community resilience, it's the ability of a community to respond to and recover from the ever-changing conditions of living on the Great Lakes coastline. It's about preparing for the varying conditions to help you with response when they do inevitably occur. The Coastal Management Program has devised a pathway to resilience to help coastal communities meet their resilience goals. The pathway is a step-by-step process for communities to follow. Our first step is technical assistance through participating in a Coastal Leadership Academy training or other training opportunities like this webinar series. Our second step is conducting a vulnerability assessment to identify gaps where resilience can be added into master plans or ordinances. Once those gaps have been identified, the next step is creating a resilient master plan or master plan chapter that is formally adopted by Michigan law, or adopting resilient policies or ordinances such as setbacks and no-build zones. And finally, our last step is developing and implementing on-the-ground projects that utilize nature-based solutions. So those are projects like green infrastructure projects for stormwater management or habitat restoration projects, or even natural shoreline protection. The Coastal Management Program provides grant assistance to help communities achieve their resilience goals. Our next grant funding opportunity will be released this October, so this webinar series is perfect timing. Maybe the webinar series will inspire you to start planning for resilience in your communities, or maybe you're ready to implement a commitment that you made at one of our Coastal Leadership Academy trainings. We're here to help you out with those goals. We can fund community-wide resilience planning projects, site-specific design and engineering projects, site-specific low-cost construction projects, and even land acquisition for conservation purposes. Please visit our website shown here on the screen, michigan.gov/coastal management, for more information. And then for those who might be interested, we're also holding a webinar next month to overview the grant funding opportunity. The date of that webinar will be found on our website once it's posted. And then I'm going to wrap things up today with the Coastal Management Program team. If you have any questions about the Pathway to Resilience or our upcoming grant opportunity, please reach out to any of us shown here on the screen. We're happy to help. We want to chat with you guys. And with that, I'm going to wrap things up and pass things back over to Leah to get us started today.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that. All righty, let's do the little screen share switcheroo here, and I will get us going. Share, and now, does everybody see the right thing on the screen? Yes, okay, great.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, just one more second while I get this window where it needs to be. Okay, here we go. Thank you, Melissa. We are so happy to have you all at this webinar series, especially folks from like far and wide. This is an exciting surprise for us. We have crafted it to be perfectly welcoming to newcomers, but also to build on some earlier partnerships between Eagle and MAP here. So one of those is the Coastal Leadership Academy. Those really focused on diving into the science of the Great Lakes coast, which is really quite special. Focused on teaching us new data tools to use and really sharing coastal knowledge among each other, introducing ourselves to our partners, and making sure that we are developing a community of practice and getting some action strategies and commitments, the ones that Melissa just mentioned, together. We particularly wanted to offer information here that would speak directly to the Coastal Leadership Academy graduates. But so we also went back and talked to each of the regional hosts to find out what they've been hearing from coastal communities since then. And of course, they were once again the tremendous partners that they've been throughout this process. And they let us know that really this idea of moving from planning to action is where many communities are right now. Looking for information about zoning tools, about addressing existing conditions, about accessing and using technical assistance. We also heard that examples and stories, both of successes and of failures, were an important learning tool and very valuable. So we made sure to incorporate one of those. You're going to hear a really terrific one today. Along the same lines, peer-to-peer learning, we want to make sure that we are learning from each other. We heard that political will is a stumbling block and can be. And so really that's what this session is focused on today, is how to communicate in such a way that we can all move together. And also, I want to put a pin in this last one. We heard concerns or interest in learning more about financial insurance and liability considerations. It's not a part of this webinar series, but we have definitely marked it down for further study and heard that that's a need. So I'm going to ask one thing of you right now, and that is in the chat box to tell us, what is the message about coastal resilience that you need your community to receive? This webinar is focused on framing your message of resilience, but it's not about telling you what message to deliver because we don't know that. What you first must do, what we all must have to do before we get to these techniques, is to have a good understanding of what that message actually is. What is the thing that you need people in your community to know so urgently that you're spending your Thursday afternoon trying to figure out how to say it so that they can hear it? So I would like you to put that message in the chat box so we can, start that peer learning and see each other's messages. So while we're thinking and kind of getting that rolling, I'm going to read a few of these, but I just want you to know we're not carrying these forward. I just want you to have something to be thinking of as we go through this. And what I'm imagining here is like the truest possible statement, like not workshopped, not wordsmithed, the content of what you as a person with your experience need people to know. So I'm thinking of things like some of the houses on our lakefront are not going to survive the next high water event. Like you might know that from your experience, and you might need your community to know that. Another example might be the county is never going to pay to rebuild that road again. If there has been a recent infrastructure disaster, you managed to rebuild it once, but like you just know that you have to do something different between now and the next time. And I will share with you while you're thinking this cheeky and definitely unworkshopped message that my daughter, as a teenager, put on a coffee mug for me as I was explaining this work to her. And it's hard to get the lighting right, but I'm going to try. It says, move or fall in, love the Great Lakes. And it has, she put a little picture of a house on it, which is adorable. It turns out this cup is made, that is made out of paper inside this, so then it got water damaged. I really could not have planned that better if I had tried to. So we have a couple in the chat. Someone has a chapter in their master plan on resiliency, but needs to move the needle from the master plan to the zoning ordinance, particularly in the area of wetlands protections. Another message that we need folks to know is that change is inevitable and our shoreline and parks are in jeopardy over time. I appreciate both of those. Feel free to continue to put them in the chat if you'd like. This is a great conversation that we're having, and I will chug along here. So I'm going to start this conversation with the basic message of coastal resilience. This one applies to all of us. Coastal development is at risk, right? That's something we need folks to know. I took these harrowing images from both the east and the west coast of Michigan. I believe them all to be during the last high water event, which is blessedly receding. But the damage was really quite scary and it was expensive. And it for sure was not the last risk event, because the water is going to come back. This writing is kind of small, but these graphs go back to 1918, and we can see that the water actually spent plenty of time in the last century at the levels that we saw a few years ago. What this graph tells a planner is that 25 years, that might be just enough time to get some regulations in place. Maybe. Now, to be sure, these were record high levels that were not seen in the last 25 years, but new work and research that's on the screen here suggests that the lakes may continue to fill past their historical levels over the coming decades, putting even more properties at risk of disaster. I would point out that the only chance we have to save the buildings that have not yet been built in a place that will soon be too close to the shore is now. And I sometimes think about how many of the buildings that were at risk now during the last event were built in the last 25 years. We missed the chance to save them, and let's not do that again. And we have a couple more comments. The beach is a fragile environment, should not be used for storage of beach personal items. Sure. Political will resonates, needing that to gather that there are better ways to protect the shorelines by using zoning ordinances. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, let's talk quickly about our public approach to disasters, because that factors into how we frame our message, because we're the public, right? It's always been the case that even when property is private, disasters are public. Congress authorized the very first federal disaster relief after a fire in New Hampshire in 1803. Country was barely 25 years old. We got right on this. And it was done then in much the same way it is now. Declare the area a federal disaster, provide financial aid and relief within that area. We did the same for a handful of fires and earthquakes and hurricanes throughout the early 1900s. And this was, the reactive approach. The story was that humans are at the mercy of the environment. So people in unfortunate circumstances like a flood or hurricane aren't responsible from a policy standpoint. And government is the purpose of banding together to make our lives better. So it's our responsibility to ease the human suffering that naturally resulted from these unforeseen, uncontrollable circumstances. But by the 1930s, the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl had sort of conflated some human tragedies, economic tragedies, poverty and farming practices, with emergent environmental tragedies like drought. And so a lot of the relief that came in the form of the New Deal dealt with economic problems that arose from the interaction of social and natural phenomena, from the crossroads there. And this reflects a sense that human actions are playing a role in certain disasters, and it's a change in the narrative that supports a change in policy. Since there was a partly human cause, there's now an opportunity for an element of prevention in the relief investment. The Federal Civil Defense Act of 1950 goes all the way to an anticipatory disaster relief effort. And that was aimed at a disaster that had no natural component at all, right? Human warfare. This is another change in policy with a change in narrative, right? In nuclear warfare, the damage created was just as great as in any natural disaster. And by proposing an emergency response, this policy suggests that humans at least should have the capability and maybe the moral responsibility to make a serious effort to fix what we break, even when it's huge. And this is the shift that opens up the policy context that we know today. Because if our narrative says that we can respond to human disaster that is at the scale of a natural disaster, and also that many disasters have elements of both, then that gets us to the idea of a comprehensive disaster response program like the Disaster Relief Act of 1974 and the creation of the Federal Emergency Management Act Agency, FEMA, in 1979. The philosophy there is that preparations for evacuation, communication, survival, they're the same in a disaster. We can prepare for them the same. So let's bring this back around to coastal hazards specifically. We have long taken a proactive approach to coastal hazards, right? We might not be able to prevent hurricanes or storm surges, but we sure can engineer for them, and we sure can, make efforts at doing the same for the Mississippi River since almost the beginning. We have dredged, we have redirected, we have filled, we have armored, we have made it largely do what we want it to. But it's always been clear that we can only afford so much of this. And the more that we've learned about flood control, the more we've been able to measure the cases where really the only cost-effective solution is to keep the things that we want to protect out of harm's way. And so that is the basic bargain that the National Flood Insurance Program is making. The public sector will offer relief from flooding disasters because we have the same moral imperative we always have to alleviate suffering. And the public sector will even work to predict where the risk will be. Those are our firm maps and our flood hazard data. But it is up to the local community to make and enforce decisions that stand a good chance of preventing disasters by keeping things we want to protect out of harm's way. The point, as the program itself phrases it, is to shift some of the risk onto local decision makers. And if managing that was an easy task, we would not be having this webinar because we would have just done it a long time ago, right? But here we are trying to figure out what we're going to do about this risk that's been shifted onto local decision makers. That phrase sounds like maybe like 1 to 3 people are just going to sit in a room and run down a checklist and then hand on a proclamation of how that risk is going to be dealt with. But we know that that's not how that works. And we probably know that because we tried it, right? Instead, we have all these people on the screen, elected leaders, appointed leaders, technical professionals, the public at large, and property owners, probably some more, who hold at least some responsibility for the decision of how to manage land that's adjacent to water. This is how our coastal land management issues turn into communications issues. So then the question that we have to ask ourselves is, okay, what are we trying to do with this communication? What is its purpose? It seems to be maybe one of the first 2 bullets on our screen, to inform people of risks and to share information. But actually, we've been doing that for a long time. And here we are still having this webinar. So we must actually have some goal that goes beyond that. Is it reducing harm? I think that's what we're trying to get to. But communication is not the thing that does that. When we get right down to it, what we want to do with our communication is to influence action. The people here in this webinar, we all know that something needs to be done. And we know that we need the people on the last slide to be a part of it. At the very, very least, we need them to consent to the actions that we take. So if we could just do the thing, the technical solution, we'd have done it. It turns out we have to win some hearts and minds first. So now the thing that we're doing is communicating, and it's its own thing. If there was a type of communication that was particularly suited to influencing action, we would probably want to start there, right? And there is. Storytelling it feels like it's having a bit of a moment right now. I was at the National Planning Conference this year, had some really impactful sessions about it. And when I was listening to it, it felt a bit like a fresh or a new tactic, which I certainly thought was welcome because I feel like I have used every last one of the old ones. But really, it seems actually a little bit deeper than that. Like we collectively are grasping something that we didn't quite know before about how our brains work. So here's what I learned when I looked into it a little bit. The first thing is just what's actually going on in our brains when we hear a story. We now have MRIs that can tell us when we monitor the brain waves of a storyteller and a listener, we can see that those waves actually start to synchronize. That joke about you're on the same wavelength, guess what? You are. And the better the listener's comprehension, the more they actually sync up. And we do already know this, I think, experientially, right? Think about being wrapped up in a story. our hearts beat faster. We make facial expressions. We might breathe a sigh of relief when the hero shows up at the end. That's really happening. We can really do that to somebody with a good story. We can take our hearts with them. We can take their bodies with us. We also now have fancy blood monitors that can show us the connection between story and actual action. Action requires attention. That's a scarce resource in the brain. Stories help attract and gather that attention by generating a tension. Interesting, those two words are so similar, that prompts the body to produce oxytocin. The more oxytocin was generated, the more the actions were influenced. And this was not some theory. This was not some, I think this might help. This was measured at Harvard with machines that the Department of Defense paid for. Don't know what they were doing with that, but it was very serious research. We also know that because diverse areas of the brain light up when we hear stories, they produce better recall and topic connection than, say, the lists and the charts we've been providing. And we are also now seeing that the emotional response has a pathway into belief systems that facts just don't seem to have access to. And in fact, it's the opposite. You might have heard that when people are confronted with a fact that directly contradicts their belief system, it can actually reinforce the belief system. But emotion seems to work in the opposite way. And I think that's funny. We don't often think about that. We're often sure that we can just toss out emotion and only focus on the facts, but we rarely discuss the opposite case when we just toss out the facts and focus on the emotion, even when we see it in action. So storytelling really acknowledges both. So if we put these two pieces of information that we've talked about so far together, we have 1, stories are how our brains work, and 2, our approach to disaster and hazard management has changed. If we add to this collection that old saw about how actions speak louder than words, we get to this idea that's in red on the screen, that public policies and actions reflect an underlying story that's illustrated by the actions we take and support. So let's take a common coastal example and think about it. What is the story being told by existing government policies that are focused on immediate redevelopment of low-lying coastal areas after storm damage? And that is generally our policy. There's very little that prevents the immediate redevelopment and, in fact, policies and funding that encourages it. Well, here are a few assumptions that are embedded in that policy. First of all, that we can afford to rebuild. That it's important to us as a society to put development in low-lying coastal areas. Otherwise, we'd let it chase us off, right? If there has been loss of life, then that is, and we rebuild, then we are communicating that that is an acceptable risk. No matter what, if there has been damage and we rebuild, we're communicating that that is acceptable to have our investments demolished. And by, not changing course, we are communicating that we're capable, we just didn't do it this time, but we're capable of prevailing over flooding in low-lying coastal areas. Now, are those stories true? Do we want to support them? If they're not true, if we actually can't afford to rebuild, and insurers are telling us in whole states that we can't, if it's not important to us as a society for development to occur so close to the shoreline or in floodplains, if in fact we can pull back a little and still be okay. If it's not acceptable for our work to be demolished over and over again, and certainly if loss of life is not acceptable, if we are in fact not capable of prevailing over the force of water, and instead we really have to learn to cooperate with it, then it's really important to not put forth and support policies and actions that rely on these things that we don't actually find to be true, and to instead align our policies with stories that rest on assumptions that are true. But crafting policy is way down the line. We're going to pull back and return our focus to framing this message. I would like to argue that we actually already do use story to frame the way that we currently communicate and connect with our neighbors and our public about coastal resilience. But we don't write the whole story. We basically fashion this choose your own adventure. Do you remember them? We're going to cover the old one on here. We present information about the problem that we need to solve, and then we ask the people in attendance to either come up with the next answer, or we'll provide some alternatives from which they can choose to get to those 42 possible endings. This setup relies on the idea that when we know better, we do better. And knowing better is certainly necessary, but Do we, though? It doesn't seem to be sufficient. Again, if it was, we wouldn't be here looking for a more effective approach to influencing action. So you may have noticed there are sources at the bottom of these slides. I want you to have access to all this information. I'd like you to learn more about it. I would like you to have it. This one in particular that I'm citing here is really informative and relevant because it's a coastal study taking place in Louisiana. And it had this interesting idea to compare the work of environmental communicators, which I would say probably all of us on this call are, with the work of environmental psychologists, totally different branch, and also to conduct a representative survey of residents to find out what they heard and what they wanted to know. So this is like a three-pronged approach. And the statement on the screen reflects an experience you might have already had. Environmental communicators have increasingly realized that information-based communication strategies, especially those that ignore the role of values, routinely fail in promoting pro-environmental and resilient planning and behavior among key publics. Those of us who are charged with communicating about the environment have sort of been sharing information until we're blue in the face. I know I have. And finding that it does not seem to be influencing action in the way that we're hoping. So the rest of this presentation is full of new ideas about communication that take into account expertise from fields like psychology. It is new to us in government anyway. Businesses are way ahead of us on this. It is called advertising, and it is very effective. I sometimes anyways describe planning as a storytelling exercise, especially a broad plan like a master plan. So the existing conditions are the last chapter. What we're working on right now, the community preferences and data, that's this chapter. The policies and actions are the next chapter. I have found this frame to be helpful both for like steering committee members who are new to the planning process and are like, what are we doing here? But also as well as for myself and my team who are likely to have the opposite problem of getting buried in details at some point of the process and need to be brought back to the broad strokes of what we're trying to do here. This frame has helped us all organize it in our minds, which really seems to support this idea that the narrative structure is a tool our brains use regularly and often. And so here we're going to move from the broad, idea of a story into the details of the message that we need our constituents to receive. And we're going to use the parts of the story to organize our thinking about it. So as you may or may not, I did not, had to Google it. Remember from 9th grade English, the parts of a story are the plot, the conflict, the point of view, the characters, and the theme and tone. We're going to start with the plot. The plot is just a basic sequence of actions, right? In our standard choose your own adventure engagement, this is where we present the conditions and the problems. It's mostly summed up in our case by our first couple of slides. Coastal development is still at risk and the water will come back. But if this was the whole story, actually, then we might not be facing the same problem that we are. We have been managing water for a long time, and the tools of engineering have largely been adequate to resolve that particular story arc. So our story clearly has another element to it, a plot twist. And that is that coastal systems, the baseline conditions, are experiencing, and I quote, a persistent directional change without precedent. This doesn't sound like much maybe in sciences, but that's until we remember that both engineering and conservation are scientific processes that require a baseline. They are interventions that try to return something, at least in this context, to its original stable condition. But now that condition is no longer stable. It is also changing. Well, engineering is expensive enough as it is, okay? Even when we think it works just like we think it should. Putting it into an uncertain environment really changes its cost-benefit analysis to the point where it might not even be available in the way that it was. It might not even be available at all. But up until now, it's been basically the biggest, maybe only tool that we have. So this is actually the plot of our story, that the solutions we know are failing us. I'll make a brief aside about the term persistent directional change without precedent. These are the words that were used in this particular report. They function to describe a term that some of us avoid for good reason in our public communications, and that's climate change. I do want to say there is very little contemporary science about coasts or environmental management that doesn't address this directly and urgently, The scientific community has long been in consensus on both like the need and the urgency of this. So here we're going to talk directly about our audience at the end of this presentation, but throughout it, I'm just going to use the most direct and accurate terms that I can, because my approach is always to clarify the message and then to tailor it. So this plot line, coastal development is at risk, the water will come back, and our historical solutions will not meet the challenge, is a new narrative, and it has some new assumptions embedded in it. We need to know those assumptions because challenges to our message often involve a clash of the underlying assumptions. This is how we end up talking past each other. We are not saying things that directly contradict, but we're saying things that have contradictory messages inside them. And that's why it is so darn frustrating to have those conversations, right? So this new understanding of the environment as much more dynamic, particularly the coastal environment, might require a new narrative that reflects these assumptions. So one of them is nature as ever-changing and dynamic. Our conventional wisdom largely thinks that we have nature subdued, or at the very least that we have it named and organized. It involves embracing an unknown future of risk, which is not common to us either. We kind of think societally we know things, and if we don't, at least the actuaries do, and we pretty much have risk nailed down. It includes the assumption that resiliency management approaches are focused on absorbing and recovering from disturbance, which is a big shift. We generally, in conventional management, focus on just removing the disturbance and making it stop. And values generally include ecosystem thinking, maintaining biodiversity, and creating space for natural system shifts. Again, these are not familiar to us. We have a hard time getting out of our silos everywhere, right? Our values are generally single subject. Our society cannot possibly value maintaining biodiversity at the rate we are extincting species. That just doesn't match up. And we much prefer to direct action as to create space. So these assumptions are important to surface and to understand in our plot. From the plot, the conflict is developed. Our historical tools will not save our treasure from the advancing seas. What are our choices now? This is where our traditional model turns it over to the meeting attendees. And I've always thought this was a little strange, right? We who live and breathe this technical issue, we've trained our whole lives for it. We go to this meeting and we try to get a lay audience up to speed on the details in about 10 minutes. And then we turn around and take orders on a solution. We who are running that meeting could maybe go a little further and help shape the way the audience thinks about that solution with the good information that we already have. So one group that's been thinking really hard about land management, conservation, and preservation for its own sake and for human enjoyment is the U.S. National Park Service. When I was looking around for guidance on communicating about environmental change and management, their work absolutely rose to the top. And they have framed the basic conflict that's facing their managers in this way. Quote, park managers today face growing challenges. As climate change interacts with other stressors such as land use change, pollution, and non-native species, ecosystems are changing beyond the bounds of historical variability. There we have it again. Ecosystem thinking, environmental stability is dead. Quote, these changes are increasingly difficult to resist. Now, remember, these are people who have the word conservation in their job title. Their first choice, and in fact, their mandate actually, is to return to the stable baseline condition. This is an admission that their science shows them clearly that this is not always an option. And then finally, they go on. Thus, managers are thinking more broadly about how to effectively conserve resources in a rapidly changing world. And in this context, the resist, accept, direct framework helps decision makers make informed, purposeful, and strategic choices. I note that even in their little illustration, they have boats and coasts in it. So that must be what they're thinking of. We're going to lean in a little bit on this conflict of our story and place it in our setting, the coastal resilience story. But will we, our heroes, choose to resist, accept, or direct? Well, here's what those choices look like. If we resist, we are engaging in efforts to maintain the status quo. This might require constant intervention. Success might be temporary and increasingly expensive. The upside is that you get to keep the things that you're used to. The example here is the perpetual maintenance of armoring, right? Armoring is expensive enough the first time, but it is also a management obligation from now until the end of time. The second choice is to accept, to allow the change to proceed uninterrupted, then react to the consequences. So this might have substantial financial or social consequences for the individual stakeholders, but it's often the easy choice for the public, right? This is the example of when the house falls into the lake and we go, "Hmm." And then the final choice is to direct, to intervene in the change to produce a new result. This might require great effort for an untested result, and it might result in a condition that would be an obvious opportunity cost under the existing paradigm. And so what that is in the coastal context are these new development and buffering patterns that give nature space to do what it's doing. So you'll notice that none of these is cost-free. None of these is the obvious solution. None of these is probably right for every single context, but they do seem to be the only three choices available to us. Notice that when I started talking about the last slide, I asked which choice we, our heroes, were going to make. That is not the way I usually phrase the question when I'm running an engagement session, right? Usually after we get done presenting the problem, the board or the sheet that we're recording things on says something like, what could be done in our community? And then we talk about that in the abstract. And the people at the meeting write down a long list of possible actions, many of which are assigned to people's roles and organizations who aren't in the room. We might even spend a little time sort of clucking about why they didn't come to this meeting. And then I, the planner, am assigned to go back to my office and to whittle this list down to the things that I think those people, roles, and organizations are in fact prepared to do. Hopefully, this is because I've been able to engage and talk to them, but truly not always. And then, we, the planners, come back a few years later. We find that 3 of the 47 items have even been begun by anyone at all. And then we start all over, right? I think this is the standard for environmental communication. We all do it. And the psychologists say they are not surprised that that does not work. In our study from the Louisiana coast, all but one of the psychologists who were interviewed, quote, rejected the information deficit model. They said, we have information about the environment. If we want people to know, good job, they do. But if we want people to do, then we have to tell them what they can do. This seems simple, but it does appear that we're overlooking it. So here's what that representative survey of people facing coastal problems in Louisiana said about what would prompt them to act. They would act if they knew what they could do about a problem, if they felt personally responsible for the problem, if they believed their actions would help, and if they were confident that they could actually do what was asked of them. Now, this is where our change in approach requires a bit more of us, the message deliverers, than the old way did. So think about the actions that we're hoping your message inspires. What exactly is it? What is our ask? So let's use an example that might be common here. Let's say that we, the trained technicians who talk about this stuff all day long, have a pretty good idea that really the thing that needs to happen in order to protect coastal health, safety, and welfare is to keep buildings further back from the shoreline than is currently being permitted, and to keep many more of the trees and grasses in place along the shoreline than we currently have. These are technical statements. Let's assume we've come to these conclusions the hard way and that we don't really have any motivational, reason for them except for trying to solve problems for either love or money, right? Well, what we do under the old paradigm is to try to get people to see what we see so that they feel what we feel and then come to the same conclusions we do. We're trying to motivate action through ownership. The idea is that if people think this up themselves, they'll be more likely to do it. So if we can just show people that bad things happen to buildings too close to the shoreline and good things happen when we preserve trees and beach grass, then they're going to come to their own conclusion. We need a setback ordinance and natural features protection, and of their own volition, they're going to engage the political process to make that happen. Raise your hand if you've seen it work like that. In practice, in this example, really the activity that most of the people you're messaging to can actually help with is not in the deciding what to do part. That is already clear. That technical solution is already out there. In order to protect that development, just the math and science says we need to move it out of harm's way and give the land space for ecosystem. Rather than a single-use function, create an effective, we just need to. So we also know what the political process is for making that happen. Study, plan, zone, enforce. If our message starts there with what we do in fact know, then we can engage this list. What can people do about rising lake levels? Absolutely nothing. What can people do about somebody else's home falling in the lake? Also nothing. What can people do about getting ordinances passed to keep new buildings away from the shoreline and preserve vegetation? Plenty. So framing our communication efforts to land on a clear and reasonable ask is a good organizing principle. For one thing, that requires us to make sure we've managed everything that we can, rather than just punting our hard questions to the vague public. That is the kind of thing that lets them ignore us, and probably the other way around too. The research said that equally as important as knowing what you can do is knowing that others are doing it. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us that people move in groups, right? Who among us has not been invited to a bold action and first looked around to be like, is anybody else doing it? We all have, right? When I worked as a planning consultant, the first question I heard about every single issue was, what are other communities doing? In the Coastal Leadership Academies, the people who shared case studies were the stars of the shows. I feel like that's going to be the case again today. When we circled back to the regional hosts to ask them what landed, it was the examples. Nothing seems to motivate us like reliable information about lived experience. But yet this is not often a part of our messaging. It'll often come up among participants, but it's not often a driver in our outgoing communication. But it's actually kind of an easy fix, right? We're doing it right now. We're working on a community of practice. We can normalize the idea that action's already underway. We can talk about what we're doing. We can talk about what partners are doing, and we can just show that change is happening. That is a good place to start. And like I said, this is really true for every planning activity, but there are some where the planning subject actually enforces collaboration. Water is one of them. Its effects are totally irrespective of municipal boundaries. The psychologists seem to have been talking amongst themselves about how their methods are underused by us. So here's an article from the American Psychological Association in 2005. That's almost 20 years ago now. And they are citing 30 years of research. So that's 50 total. In this example, they're doing experiments in hotels and national parks to see what kinds of messages actually change behavior, right? They found out that the most effective message to get a result was to let people know that other people are doing it. So in this example, focused on reusing hotel towels, we can see how it works. All the messages give us an action to do. They all tell us that we're contributing to solving a problem, but the one that broadens our field of vision to the people around us, not to future people, not to an abstract environment, certainly not to a business interest like the hotel, is the one that most influenced action. Our story needs to reflect the whole cast of characters. There are very few one-person shows, if you think about it. And to that, I will emphasize the word whole, including the challengers and the opposition view. In a sense, it's the antagonist who makes a story out of a series of any events. That's where the tension comes in, and remember, our story needs that. I would argue that this is really familiar territory in our context. The American political and legal systems are built around the idea of productive conflict. We divide a group of decision makers into protagonists and antagonists of their own stories. They try to prevail at the ballot or in the court. It's also the basis of private enterprise, the idea that competition makes everyone into their own protagonist and places them in opposition to the others of their field. When we're communicating, acknowledging a conflicting force in a respectful way is a trustworthy act. Our listeners already know it exists. And I picked Darth Vader here because he is a complex character who has his own story. Everyone does. Question for us is, how does our hero want to act in the face of conflict? But we want to get to its productive and sharpening benefits without wasting time and resources fighting for fighting's sake. We need to find out where the opposition goes in our story, not to try to get rid of it. Can't. This is how we use conflict rather than getting sunk by it. The last story element I want to talk about is maybe the one that we have been getting the most wrong: theme and tone. On this slide are some images that I'm sure you've seen, and if not these, then ones just like it, right? Burning, drowning, and protesting about it. This seems to be the whole public conversation about the environment right now, both in the media and among ourselves. Thing about this is it's true, so that's compelling. And in the context of a choose your own adventure, the approach makes a certain amount of sense. It's attention getting, it describes the problem. But the psychologists say that in terms of influencing action, it does the opposite. we can do this experiment right here, right? Spend a few seconds concentrating on these images, watching California burn, thinking about Vermont, climate haven, flood, thinking about those polar bears and their stuffy coats just suffocating in Florida type weather. And now turn your attention to your body. Do you feel energized? Like you can know what to do and are ready to do it? Or maybe do you feel heaviness, like almost a backing away inside your own body? I myself literally want to go take a nap. This satisfies none of the criteria for encouraging action. I don't feel responsible. I don't know what will help. I don't know what I can do. Psychologists have a word for this too, that has only just now showed up in our communications work, and it's trauma. That is a normal and predictable response for our overwhelmed brains to disengage from the source of the overwhelm. We're intending our message to inspire action, and it is inducing paralysis. Okay, what makes the difference? Action, backed by a belief that you can do something and get the result you expected from it. So now we're right back to, this is a new article, but we're right back to our first person active voice checklist. Action is the solution both before and after the despair. Okay, how do we get there then? What is going to pull our hero out of the abyss of despair and paralysis and into the action scene where we literally save the world? Does anyone have any guesses? Have you seen this movie before? Of course you've seen this movie before. It's love. You've read the book. It's at the heart of just about any good story. But since we are being all scientific today, I will be happy to use the scientist word for it, which is attachment. Specifically, place attachment. Bringing our coastal management conversations out of the scary realm of polar bears and hurricanes and sea levels and onto the actual land that we're responsible for managing. Just relentlessly returning our focus to what is actually happening between our people and our land as they are right now is the off-ramp to that spiraling doom loop. We, in our context, don't have to rely on tension or fear to get people's attention. We're talking to people who are attached to a place and it already has their attention. People already want to be doing things there and they know that they have something in common with the other folks who are there. We can even help places speak for themselves. We can use signs, interpretation to allow people to engage with it directly outside of any interaction with another person. Letting attachment frame a resilience message, and I'm not scared to call it love, is not really a standard approach. But I would argue that it makes the most sense of anything I've yet heard. Why else would we be going to the trouble of supporting a place's resilience to great expense and difficulty if we weren't attached to it? The last bullet on this slide telling us that people who took the representative coastal survey in Louisiana really wanted to hear more about how environmental issues are showing up in their own communities. This directly validates just what we've been talking about here. They are most interested in place-based storytelling. But the last thing I would like to say about theme and tone is that there sure is a needle to thread here. While we're not trying to inflict our own trauma by blaring on about fear and danger, there are many who come to this conversation having already experienced some. The psychologists and the public health experts too have been clearly documenting a sharp rise in anxiety and grief over the persistent directional change without precedent and the way that it is affecting our familiar places. This actually fits perfectly with our understanding of place attachment. Isn't the potential for grief always the risk of love? A message might not want to lead with that, but it should certainly make room for it when it arises. Okay, now that we've talked about our message and how to frame it, now we can think about tailoring it for our audience. Because again, my approach is always to start with the clearest and truest statement and then to shape it to fit the listener's needs. The audience is absolutely a critical piece of the communication puzzle, but we always want to make sure we're saying what we need to say. So here we are back at that good coastal study that interviewed both communicators and psychologists, and the two groups agreed on a whole set of criteria for doing that tailoring. You should know your audience, we all should, well enough to be able to do and not do these things. Tell local stories, build relationships with the people you need to talk to, and speak to them in ways that you know resonate with them, targeted messaging. There are also concerns across the board about source credibility. Only cite people you think that they might believe. Talking about issues, impacts, and solutions that the target audience can relate to that make sense to the conversation you're having. And avoiding controversial terms. Said we'd loop back to that, didn't I? And here we are. So I'm again so delighted that we have folks from elsewhere. So here in Michigan, there are a few places where I have been instructed not to use the term climate change in teaching, with the reason that those specific words have the effect of derailing the whole conversation. If this is your understanding, better yet, experience of the audience in your community, I'm sure not here to challenge any approach you might take. And if you invite me to your community, I will take that approach there too. It's up to you to know your audience, and I believe you. But I will acknowledge that we're often driven in government by the loudest voices in the squeaky wheels. That is what's in front of us. And yet we in government are so responsible for serving everyone, whether they yell at us in public or not. And so I would like to pass along a tool that is trying to help us understand where our communities as a whole are in this ongoing paradigm shifting conversation. This is the Yale Climate Opinion Map, which has done its best to survey, model, and validate views related to climate change at the county level. So it looks at beliefs, at risk perceptions, and support for specific policies, including who should carry them out. I want to just look quickly at a couple so you can see the information that's available. So first, on this landing page, estimated percentage of adults who think the term that they use is global warming, who think that global warming is happening. The national average is 72%. And familiarize ourselves with the scale here. Everything in the warmer colors is 51% and above. Everything in the cooler colors is 50% and below. So you can see overall, largely a majority in all places agree with that statement. And now I'm going to zoom us right into Michigan. If you're from here, maybe you can pick out your county on the map. And we see here that nowhere in the state of Michigan actually is there a percentage less than 50% where that is true. And actually, if I hover over here, I can see that actually no less than 55%, no less than 60%. The minimum of our counties have a 61% agreement with that statement. We'll move on to risk perception of those who, rather than just thinking about it, what about those that are truly worried about it? What does that look like? You see that the colors get a little bit lighter, indicating a little bit lower intensity of agreement, but still nowhere are we under this threshold. In a few places, we are right at the 50%, 50 to 55% mark, and then it goes up from there. And then finally, well, I do want to say this. I've heard a lot about accommodating those who don't want to talk about this. I wonder sometimes if we're worrying adequately representing those that do and those that really do. And then finally, the last interesting thing that I think is of great interest to the folks on this call is this policy support that local officials should do more to address global warming. That's the only one we're going to look at here, but I'll note when you explore this yourself that there's also state and national figures here. So now we get a couple of counties that are in blue, although I will say that still the majority of them remain, but still the vast majority of counties remain above majority support. And even of those, if I hover over them, they tell us what the number is. And in most places, it is still at 50%. In 2 counties, it is at 49%. Now, those are folks that are holding us responsible for this. I don't think that this information was information that I had before exactly in quite this quantified way. So I hope that it is helpful to you too. And so now we're just going to come right back around and sum up a little bit. There are good reasons for doing things the way that we have been. It appears to be giving agency over solutions to the public. It focuses on the unique qualities of a municipality. It attempts to convey the urgency of the matter, but it's not working like we want it to. So here are some other alternatives. Think of the story that surrounds the message your community must know. The plot for all of us in coastal management is that environmental stability is dead, so our tools are less reliable. That's where we're starting. The conflict is the same for all of us too. Do we resist? Do we accept? Do we redirect? It's how we resolve this for each piece of coast that makes our situations unique. People want to know what they can do and how it will help. People want to know what other people are doing and how that's going. And finally, optimism is much more effective at motivating behavior than doom and gloom. But it's okay to acknowledge loss. And now I would like to introduce you to a community who knew everything you just heard well before I did. Juan Ganum is the city manager for the city of Bridgman and also a member of the Shoreline Resilience Committee that grew out of Bridgman's participation in a Coastal Leadership Academy. We heard just wonderful things from the regional host about that committee's work since the Coastal Leadership Academy, and it turns out even before then. And Juan has generously agreed to share their story about place-based action so that you can see what other folks are doing. I'm going to stop my share here so that Juan can take it away.
Hey, hello, everyone. I'm going to bring up my screen. Oh, hopefully everyone can see it.
Yes.
I think I've lost everyone. Hold on just a second, please. Okay. I'm not seeing everyone. I guess that doesn't really make a difference.
That's because I spotlighted you, Juan. If you want to go up to view, you can adjust your view.
See, I used to know this backwards and forwards when I was running our Zoom meetings every day or every week. Let me see, view. Sorry, folks. Okay. I'll figure it out. I'll work with it. We've got to press forward. So I understand we've got some folks from Kansas and North Carolina. Probably the rest of us are in Michigan. So I did not include a location map of Bridgman, but we're going to go with this, right? So Bridgman is over here on the west coast of Michigan. Hopefully I haven't got that flipped around. We're right in the southwest corner of the state. 94 bisects the city, and we're about 16 miles north of the Indiana state line and maybe about an hour and 20 minutes away from Chicago. The Bridgman story begins with the introduction of the concept of resiliency itself. In 2017, we were invited to participate in a Planning for Resilient Communities effort, which is essentially a program to update our master plan. I've been the city manager here for a little under 9 years, and when I arrived in 2015, on my desk, we had a master plan that was fairly recent that was adopted in 2014. Nowhere in that master plan was the term resiliency. Nowhere in that master plan did we discuss erosion or water levels or certainly climate change. Those terms were just not included. And along comes this fantastic opportunity that was introduced to us, which was a multi-jurisdictional planning program that brought all these resources to bear on the small community of Bridgman. Michigan Association of Planning, Michigan Technological University, the University of Michigan. And like any planning effort, we began with some community meetings to engage the public, right? Most of those of you who are planners have gone through these meetings before in your communities on the way to creating a master plan. But what distinguished the efforts here for the first time was that we were getting them through the lens of resiliency. We had expertise, we had folks that specialized in marine hydrodynamics, which I had never even heard the term before. And we had the foremost expert on marine hydrodynamics here from Michigan Tech. And he was basically explaining to everyone the impacts of the hydrodynamics on the city's coast. And we have this incredible resource here because we're a coastal community. Here's a picture of one of the workshops we had. And it really began to reframe how we look at master planning and mitigating for potential issues of climate change. Those concepts were really never discussed before. And we brought, like I said, we brought all these resources to bear in Bridgman, and resiliency became part of our planning and zoning lexicon. And I think that's an important thing to note here because it's what created a springboard for further acceptance and action.
Juan, I am so sorry to interrupt you. We are seeing Wicked Problems 5 Whys. Is that what you think we're seeing?
No, that's not what you should be seeing.
We saw PowerPoint for a minute and now we see 5 Ys.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to go
Oh,
back
no,
to
that's
that.
quite
Boy,
all right. I just want to make sure you are showing what you want to.
I'm keeping everybody on their toes here. That's part of the Coastal Leadership Program packet, which is great, which I'll be talking about. All right, can you see a picture of a bunch of folks in a planning meeting now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, folks. So as I mentioned, this effort basically introduced the concept that served as a springboard for us to begin to understand and accept resiliency. And it culminated with this phenomenal video that was crafted by the folks at the University of Michigan that summarized the planning effort and our efforts here locally to try to protect our shoreline. It's available. I don't know how many, if I would love to send a link out later so people can see it, because it was a wonderful way of capturing the effort and then helping spread the word for the folks that weren't able to attend those meetings, even though there were quite a few people that were engaged and participated in those. Shortly after the master plan was adopted in 2019, we began struggling with coastal erosion itself, and the water levels were increasing. And in December of 2019, the situation got so bad in Bridgman that we had to solicit and enlist the help of everyone within the community to come to the beach, Waco Beach, and fill sandbags to protect our beach house. The city is blessed with this phenomenal beach house that acts as a community meeting place right on the beach. And the water was lapping about 25 feet from the wall. And several hundred people came out in December of 2019 to help fill sandbags. And I know this scene was repeated all across the state of Michigan because water levels are so high. But that really drove home again the point that we really need to take a look at resiliency and how we do things in Bridgman. Fast forward to January and February of 2022. The city of Bridgman had several folks that participated in the Coastal Leadership Academy that was sponsored and promoted by Eagle, MAP, and NOAA. And I think this was really the turning point for us because not long thereafter, we had so much enthusiasm with the folks who participated. And what I'm showing you right now is the city council report where our city council created this ad hoc committee, the Shoreline Protection Team, which ended up being the Shoreline Resiliency Committee. And you can see the number of folks who participated in the Coastal Leadership Academy. That includes our Parks and Recreation Director, our Planning Commission Chair, a resident of Lake Charter Township, which is the township that surrounds the city, one of our council members who happens to be a Shoreline resident, the building official and zoning administrator, Brad Mattner, who is on this call and behind that door, and then Gene Schoon, a resident of the city of Bridgman. So I think we had the largest contingent of folks participate in that academy. And I attribute part of that to the work that was done previously, the awareness that was raised previously, both as a part of our master planning effort and then the high water levels that really raised awareness within the city and the surrounding area. So these folks formed essentially the team that would lead us forward in addressing our resiliency efforts. And it's noteworthy that the city council decided to formalize the body by creating an ad hoc committee. Here's the mission of the committee. I won't read it, but I did highlight that the committee does engage with stakeholders. So one of the purposes of this committee is not just to advise the council and advise the planning commission in making land use decisions that will help mitigate against impacts, climate-derived impacts and coastal impacts. It's also to help promote that to the community and raise awareness. As a part of that, we of course utilized our website to spread the word, and we've got a newsletter that was crafted. Also on this call, I believe, is Ellen Reagan. She's one of the folks that I mentioned. She's a township resident, which is noteworthy. And she brings her expertise in writing, and she's created quite a bit of content and narrative that we've used to help educate the public and inform folks. So one of the things that the committee started doing, or one of the things that we attacked, was creating an Earth Day event. So last year when we got together, the committee meets about once every couple of months. And we decided that to raise awareness in the community, we would have an Earth Day event on Earth Day in 23 earlier this year at the beach. And it was promoted locally, and quite a few people came. And we, as you can see here from this slide, we had 30 people, and in 30 minutes, we collected 30 pounds of trash. But that Earth Day event wasn't just about collecting trash on the beach. That Earth Day event involved an educational component. We had a gentleman from MSU, specifically Michigan State University's Department of Geography, Environment and Spatial Science, gave a presentation. And we also began discussing ways of utilizing drones to monitor and capture data along the shoreline itself. So we had the benefit of a pilot, an airline pilot in Bridgman, who offered his services and his drone to help educate folks on how to capture the data points. So it was really a fantastic event, and that itself launched into further action. And here's a copy of the Shoreline Resiliency Committee newsletter. Ellen wrote an excellent article, and the city of Bridgman has a newsletter that goes out to everyone within the city and the township. It's a collaborative effort between the township, the city, the public schools locally, and the library. And it goes out 3 times a year, and we dedicated a significant amount of space to helping educate folks on this particular issue. So we talked about the committee's efforts, and we promoted the Earth Day event and talked about what was done. And now I'm happy to say that we've got our second event this upcoming Saturday. So this Saturday at 10 o'clock back at Waco Beach, we're going to do another set of presentations for folks, and there will be another another cleanup, beach cleanup. And what's unique about this particular effort, and something that I think can be translated into other communities, is the first cleanup day that we had back in April, we invited the Boys and Girls Club in Bridgman, and they sent a small group of students to the event, and they were really enthusiastic about participating. So we told them we'd like them to come back, and we did more than just invite them back for the second event this upcoming Saturday. We had a logo design contest. So we asked them to come up with designs to help us promote the effort of shoreline resiliency. And as you can see here, a young lady named Sky Williams had the winning logo design, and we turned them into t-shirts, which the kids will get this upcoming Saturday when they do the cleanup. We've got stickers, we've got water bottles, and we really think that involving the students is a critical way of engaging the community. I mean, that's the students themselves, the young kids brought their families, and that is such an impactful way of spreading the message through a small community, really through any community. Okay, along the lines of engaging school kids, this slide right here is a picture. I'm involved in Junior Achievement. I don't know how many folks are familiar with Junior Achievement, but it's a fantastic organization that puts volunteers in schools. And I go into the second grade class in Bridgman Elementary School every year, and I thoroughly enjoy it. And at the end of this 5-week session, we invite the kids to come to City Hall. And one of the things we do, besides have them sit in police cars and climb on fire trucks, is we do a mock city council meeting where some of the students become council members. One of them gets to be the mayor and has the opportunity to hit the gavel. And then the rest of them are the townsfolk. And they get to make a decision, just like a city council would. And even though we haven't implemented this yet, this is one of the things that I plan on talking to the Shoreline Resiliency Committee about. Is this is a great way to raise awareness for issues. This particular picture that you're looking at here, these kids got a chance to pick a design for the T-shirt that we sell at Waco Beach. And there's no reason you couldn't introduce concepts regarding coastal resiliency and help educate these kids and then help them spread the word back when they get with their families. So that's something that we really hope to try to accomplish. I don't really have much more, but I'd love to talk to the rest of the group about what we've done here. Hello?